This girl just tried to kill her father to get the money in the safe. My younger brother said that in front of two police officers just as I stepped through the front door after my night shift at the hospital. My father was lying on the living room floor. The family safe stood wide open. $90,000 had disappeared, and the only person they were pointing at was me. But what froze me in place wasn't the baseless accusation, it was the cold look on my entire family's faces as they stood there, not a single person, not even one, speaking up to say they believed me. There's a sentence I used to hear a lot. The deepest wounds don't come from strangers, they come from the people you call family. But if one day your own family turns you into the criminal, what would you do? Bow your head and accept the blame, or force the truth into the light? Before I continue this story, let me ask you something small. Where are you listening to this story? In your living room, in your car, or after a long day? Leave a comment and let me know. And if you enjoy stories like this, hit like and subscribe, but don't leave halfway through, because what I discovered a few days later completely destroyed my family. My name is Scarlett Hayes, 29 years old, a nurse at a hospital in Boston. That night, I had just finished a 14-hour shift in the emergency department, the smell of disinfectant from the staff room still clinging to me as I drove back to my family's old house in Cambridge. It was almost dawn, and the street was so quiet I could hear the tires rolling over the cold, damp pavement. From a distance, I could already see red and blue lights reflecting against the windows of my house. Two police cars were parked right in front of the entrance. One neighbor stood on the porch across the street, arms crossed, watching like they had just discovered an interesting story in a neighborhood that was usually silent. I turned off the engine, stepped out of the car, and walked quickly toward the door. The front door was wide open, the living room lights blazing. Dylan stood right in the doorway, his shoulder leaning against the wooden frame as if he had been waiting for a long time. The way he looked at me wasn't the way a younger brother looks at his sister. He simply lifted his chin toward the two officers behind him and accused me. I walked into the house. My father, Richard Hayes, was lying on his side on the floor beside the coffee table, while one officer checked his pulse. There was a small cut on his forehead. The wall-mounted safe behind the sofa hung open, its heavy steel door tilted to one side like a mouth frozen open. One officer stood up and looked at me. "Are you Scarlett Hayes?" he asked briefly. I nodded. Another officer stepped closer, his voice more serious. "Ms. Hayes, if this video is real, you could be detained right now." I looked around the room. Not a single person in my family opened their mouth to say I was innocent. He spoke slowly. The cameras in the house showed me entering the living room at 3 a.m. I let out a short laugh. Not because it was funny, but because my mind hadn't caught up with what that sentence even meant. I said I had been at the hospital all night. I hadn't left once. Dylan stood by the door with his arms crossed, his cold expression surprising me. He said I had secretly come home. One of the officers took out his phone, opened a video clip, and turned the screen toward me. The image was slightly blurry under the pale yellow living room lights. A woman walked in from the hallway, long hair, a dark coat, a familiar walk that made my throat go dry. She stopped in front of the safe. When she turned her head slightly, the light wasn't strong enough to show her face clearly, but the hair and body shape looked terrifyingly similar to mine. I shook my head immediately and said that wasn't me. Dylan replied in a steady voice that cameras don't lie. I turned to look at my father. He stared at me for a few seconds, his eyes heavy. "Scarlett, you really didn't do this?" He had opened his eyes but still looked dizzy. I waited for something else, but he fell into a frightening silence. On the table beside the sofa was something that made my heart sink. My mother's silver necklace. I always wore it to work, a thin chain with a round pendant engraved with the letter M, Margaret, my mother's name. But now it lay right beside the open safe like a piece of evidence placed perfectly in the right spot. One officer nodded slightly toward the door and said it might be better if I stepped outside for a moment. I backed out onto the porch. The looks from neighbors standing farther away made each step feel heavy as stone. The Boston morning air was cold and damp, mist clinging to the car windows. I sat in the driver's seat, my hands still smelling like hospital disinfectant. My phone vibrated in my coat pocket. A message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. Just one short line. If you want to know who really took the money, don't trust your brother. A second message appeared right after that. The cameras in the house didn't record just one person. I immediately called the number back. I sat in the car for several minutes, staring at the phone screen as if afraid the messages would disappear. The street in front of the house still flashed with police lights. An ambulance had just pulled up to the door. Two paramedics hurried inside. Everything was happening clearly right in front of me. I started the car and drove off without looking back at the house even once. In the cold silence of Mass Ave near dawn, I realized I was gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles had turned white. I needed someone who believed me, and the only person I could think of right now was Elena. Elena had been my friend since college. Later, she studied law and worked for a civil law office in downtown Boston. She was the kind of person people turned to first whenever things became a mess. The living room light in Elena's house was still on when I parked outside. I knocked once. She opened the door almost immediately, her hair tied quickly at the back of her neck. A sweater draped over her shoulders as if she had just woken up. She looked at me for a second, then stepped aside. "Come in." I walked inside. Elena poured me a glass of water before asking anything. I told her everything in detail. Elena sat quietly, listening carefully. When I finished speaking, the room stayed silent for a few seconds. Outside the window, the morning light began fading out the last traces of night's blue. "Scarlett," she said slowly, "in your house, who manages the camera system?" The question was so simple it took me a few seconds to understand. "Dylan," I answered. "He installed it last year. Said it was to protect the house." Elena nodded slightly. "Do you remember the last time you saw the original footage from the cameras?" I shook my head. The truth was, I had never watched them. Dylan always handled everything. He installed the cameras, put the app on my father's phone, and said if anything happened, he would check it. Elena stood up, walked to the desk in the corner, and opened her laptop. "All right," she said. "If the cameras recorded you there at 3 a.m., then we need to see exactly what the cameras actually captured." I watched the laptop screen as Elena opened the video inspection software. A quiet thought slid through my mind. If Dylan controlled that entire system, then Dylan was also the only one who could touch it. Elena turned to me. "Scarlett," she said, her voice still calm, "are you sure the video they showed the police was the original?" I froze, because for the first time since leaving that house, another possibility began to appear. I took out my phone, opened the home management app Dylan had installed for me to monitor my father's health, and handed it to Elena. She didn't look at it right away. Instead, she connected the phone to her laptop with a cable and accessed the system cache directly to find data that hadn't been overwritten yet. Elena opened the house's camera system. After only a few seconds, she suddenly stopped. The screen flickered. A notification appeared. "Video files are being deleted remotely." Elena looked at me immediately. "Scarlett, someone is deleting evidence." She didn't need to say more. In that house, there was only one person with access to the camera system. Multiple small frames appeared on the screen, each one a different angle of the house. The living room, the hallway, the back door, the garage. The timeline stretched beneath each clip. Elena moved the cursor back and forth a few times, then fast-forwarded to around 3 a.m. The numbers on the timeline moved quickly. 2:58, 2:59, 3 o'clock. The living room footage appeared. Everything looked exactly like the clip the police had shown me. Elena paused the video, dragged the timeline back a few seconds, and zoomed in on the bottom corner of the screen. "Do you see this?" she said, pointing at the small timestamp in the corner of the frame. The time numbers on the screen didn't match the version the police had shown me outside the house. The police video said 3 a.m., but the original data said 2:47. Elena pressed a few more keys and opened the raw data window. "This timestamp was altered," she said. "The time was falsified." She replayed the clip again. The woman on the screen walked toward the safe. The living room light fell across her hair, leaving her face hidden in shadow. Then, right as she turned her head slightly, Elena froze the frame. The image held still. The face remained dark, but the angle of the chin and the line of the nose were visible enough to notice one thing. Elena looked at me. "Scarlett, that person isn't you." The feeling at that moment was both relief that I was innocent and terror because I realized I had been set up. And you, if you were in my position and saw someone impersonating you on camera like that, what would your first reaction be? Leave an emoji in the comments that shows that feeling. I stared at the screen for a few more seconds. Just one small detail. Her chin was more square, and the way she tilted her head was different. Elena kept playing the footage. The woman opened the safe, took something out, and quickly left the frame. The video switched to the hallway camera, then to the back door camera. After a few seconds, Elena opened the camera outside the garage. The image there was darker. A car appeared in the corner of the frame. The headlights turned on, then off quickly. The car backed out of the garage and left the driveway at 3:15 a.m. Elena paused the video and zoomed in on the license plate. Both of us stared at the numbers on the screen. Elena shook her head. "That car doesn't belong to your family." She minimized the window and opened the front door camera again. The woman appeared a few seconds before entering the house. She stood in front of the digital keypad beside the door and typed in a code. A small beep sounded in the video. The door opened. Elena crossed her arms and studied the screen for a moment. "This person knows the code to your house." 3 names appeared in my mind. Elena turned to me. "Scarlett, how many people know that door code?" I looked again at the paused video on the screen, the woman's hand still on the keypad. 3, I said slowly. "Me, my father, and Dylan." But out of those 3 names, only one had just stood in front of the house, pointing straight at me in front of the police. Elena closed the video and opened another tab on her computer before asking me a short question. "Scarlett, whose name is the house under?" I answered almost immediately. "My father." Elena nodded and asked another question. "But does Dylan handle the house's financial paperwork?" I hesitated slightly. In truth, for years, Dylan had been the one talking to the bank. My father was older and uncomfortable with computers. Dylan always said he would handle everything. Elena noticed the hesitation and pulled the phone closer to herself. "Give me the bank branch where your family's mortgage is." I read out the name. Elena made the call. The conversation lasted only a few minutes. Most of the time she just listened and wrote things down. When she hung up, she looked at me longer than usual. "Scarlett, you need to hear this." She turned the laptop screen toward me. A loan summary appeared. The number in the middle of the screen made me look again to make sure I hadn't read it wrong. $250,000. I looked up at Elena. She nodded slightly. "A new mortgage loan was opened 3 months ago." "My father didn't take out any loan recently." Elena shook her head. "According to the bank records, the person who signed the paperwork was Dylan Hayes." The room went silent for a few seconds. Suddenly, I remembered the times Dylan had handed papers to my father to sign. My father always trusted him, and he never carefully read what he was signing. Elena opened another file. "If this loan isn't paid on time, the bank has the right to seize the house." I stared at the number on the screen. $250,000, a number far too large for my family. Elena continued, her voice still calm but clearer now. If your father finds out about this, Dylan will lose the house." At that moment, all the scattered pieces in my mind suddenly locked together in a cold, precise way. The family bond I had always tried to protect had become the shield Dylan used to hide his own mistakes. And that was when I realized something painfully clear. When money becomes the only thing on the table, blood ties become just another piece to sacrifice. Have you ever had to look at someone you loved most and suddenly realize you never truly knew who they were? And he would lose control of the money too. I leaned back in the chair, feeling everything begin to connect in a way that made my chest heavy. Dylan needed money because he was trapped in a massive loan. And that night, $90,000 from the safe disappeared. Elena tapped the table lightly to bring my attention back. "Scarlett, think carefully. If Dylan needed money and was afraid your father would discover the loan, then he needed another story for everyone to focus on." I looked back at the laptop screen, the video, the woman who looked like me, the open safe, the police standing at the door. Elena spoke slowly. "A burglary inside the house, with a suspect who fits perfectly." She paused for a second before asking the question that made the air in the room heavier. "Scarlett, if Dylan staged that video, then who played you?" Elena started with the most obvious thing we had, the license plate of the car that left the garage at 3:15 a.m. Elena zoomed in on the plate. She entered the number into a search system. The screen loaded for a few seconds. When the result appeared, Elena frowned. "This car doesn't belong to your family." "Then whose is it?" I asked. Elena opened another page, then turned the screen toward me. "An acting agency." The room suddenly went silent, because at that moment we began to understand the woman in the video might just be an actress, the kind of company that provides models and actors for small roles in local commercials or audition recordings. Elena picked up the phone and called the office directly. The conversation lasted longer than I expected. Most of the time she just asked questions, wrote notes, and occasionally glanced at me. Elena hung up slowly. "Scarlett, they remember the person who hired the service." I looked at her. "Who?" Elena didn't answer right away. She turned the laptop toward me. In the contract email, the client had sent several photos of me. Side profile, hairstyle, the way I walked. But the client's name had been hidden behind an intermediary company code. I read the email again. One small detail made my spine turn cold. The person who hired them hadn't only sent photos of me, they had also sent a floor plan of my living room. I stared at that line for a long time. Elena continued telling me what she had heard from the agency. The actress had originally believed it was just a test shoot for a home security commercial, but Dylan had paid extra money just to have her practice walking around the living room several times to look as real as possible. She was also instructed to turn her head at a specific angle so the camera wouldn't capture her face clearly. I leaned back in the chair and watched the video again. The walk looked like mine, the hair looked like mine, the lighting deliberately darkened the face. Everything had been prepared in advance, but one detail still didn't fit. $90,000 from the safe had vanished. Elena seemed to think of that too. She turned back to the laptop. This time it was bank transaction data she had just requested from the loan records. Lines of transactions scrolled down the screen. Elena slowed the mouse, then stopped on one single line. The transaction date matched the night of the theft. She turned the screen toward me. "Scarlett," she said, "money was transferred into Dylan's account at 3:30 a.m. The number next to it made the room fall completely silent. $90,000. At that moment, I thought for a moment and then stood up. Elena's eyes showed she understood there was a conversation I couldn't avoid. By then, Boston was fully awake in daylight. I drove back to the familiar house. The police cars and ambulance were gone. Only Dylan's car remained parked in front of the garage. The front door wasn't locked. I walked inside. Dylan was standing in the kitchen, opening the refrigerator as if nothing had happened the night before. When he saw me, he froze for a second. Why did you come back? I didn't answer right away. I set my bag on the living room table and took out 2 stacks of documents and the USB Elena had copied. I placed everything on the table. Dylan looked at them and frowned. What's this? I turned the laptop toward him. The original video started playing. The woman walked into the living room. Long hair, dark coat. Dylan stood still for a few seconds, then let out a short laugh. What exactly are you trying to prove? I paused the video at the exact frame Elena had zoomed in on earlier. The angle of the chin was different. The camera angle was different. Then I opened the garage camera footage. The car backed out of the house at 3:15 a.m. I pushed another stack of papers toward him. A copy of the contract hiring the actress. The name of the client, Dylan Hayes. He looked down and then back up. The smile disappeared. The air in the room grew thick. So what do you think this proves? Dylan said through clenched teeth. I quietly opened the bank transaction page on the laptop. 3:30 a.m., $90,000 transferred directly into his account. Dylan stopped smiling. He crossed his arms, walked around the table once, and stopped right in front of me. You don't have proof I took the money, he challenged. You're just guessing. I didn't respond. I let the garage camera video keep playing. Dylan stared at the screen and then laughed again. You're going to use a blurry video, some anonymous contract, and a bank transaction to accuse me? You're panicking, so you're trying to piece them together. I stayed silent and calmly opened the second video file. The garage appeared, the car backing out at 3:15 a.m. Then I presented the email copy for hiring the actress. This time Dylan's confidence vanished. He fell silent, his hand tightening on the edge of the table. You still don't have proof, he said, but his voice slowed. I looked straight into his eyes. No, I'm just waiting to see how far you can go with your lies. And right then, he slipped. One sentence came out before he even realized it. If you hadn't come home that early, the plan would have been perfect. He had confessed to everything. He had hired someone with hair exactly like mine, staged a fake video so our father would believe I took the money instead of questioning the loan. To him, it was the simplest way to push me out of his life. Dylan breathed heavily, as if everything in his head had just shattered at once. But there was one thing he didn't realize. The garage camera had still recorded the car leaving, and the bank transaction recorded every number exactly. The moment Dylan finished speaking, the house fell into silence. Only the ticking of the wall clock in the living room remained. I closed the laptop, gathered the documents on the table, and placed them back into my bag. Dylan watched every movement I made, anger in his eyes mixed with a trace of worry he tried to hide. What are you going to do? He asked. I stopped at the living room door. What should have been done from the beginning? I left the house. 15 minutes later, I was standing in front of the police station with Elena. She placed the entire file, the original videos, the actress contract, and the bank transaction copies on the desk in front of the investigator. He reviewed everything one by one. No one spoke much. Only the sound of the computer mouse clicking and papers turning. When the garage camera footage reached the frame where the car left the house, the investigator paused. He looked at Elena, then at me. You're sure this is original data? Elena nodded. From the camera server, not edited. He exhaled slowly. The case was reopened that same morning. 2 police cars returned to the house I had just left not long before. I stood on the sidewalk across the street as they walked up the porch. Dylan opened the door. The moment he saw the 2 officers, his face changed instantly. He stepped back, then suddenly turned and ran toward the back hallway. But he didn't get far. My father appeared at the end of the hallway, a bandage still across his forehead. He stood directly in front of the back door. Dylan stopped. Move, Dylan said quickly. My father didn't move. He looked at Dylan for a long time, his gaze heavier than any shout. What did you do to your sister? He asked. Dylan didn't answer. The 2 officers stepped forward behind him. The handcuffs clicked shut with a dry metallic sound. Dylan turned his head and looked at me one last time as they led him out of the house. His eyes were no longer filled with anger, only restrained panic. The investigator quickly read the charges: financial fraud, staging evidence, providing false information to the police. Our quiet street had a few neighbors watching again from a distance, just like the morning before, except this time every pair of eyes was focused on Dylan. When the police car drove away, my father remained standing on the porch. He looked over at me. This was the first time in days he had looked directly into my eyes. There was no apology, just a heavy look. In it was relief that the truth was finally clear, but also something else I had never seen before: shame. I stood still for a few seconds as the midday wind moved through the familiar street. Justice had finally arrived. But the feeling inside me did not feel like victory. It felt like a large, empty space that had opened between people who once called each other family. The street in front of the house looked like any other afternoon in the neighborhood. Only my family's house no longer felt the same. I walked onto the porch. My father was still standing there, leaning against the doorframe as if he needed support. The bandage on his forehead showed beneath the pale sunlight. We stood facing each other for several seconds without speaking. In the living room, the safe was still open, its heavy steel door leaning to one side. Everything in the house remained exactly the same as the night everything happened, except Dylan was no longer there. A few days later, the case moved to court. Dylan faced multiple charges at once: financial fraud, falsifying evidence, and providing false information to the police. The numbers in the bank records made things clearer than any defense argument could. A $250,000 loan, $90,000 taken from the safe. A plan prepared carefully enough that it had almost destroyed my entire life. But the consequences did not stop there. The loan Dylan signed under my father's name still existed. The bank didn't care who was right or wrong inside our family. They only cared about the number written in the contract. One afternoon, I sat with my father at the old kitchen table while he reread the documents the bank had sent. In the end, he had to sell part of the land behind the house to pay off that debt. The land where my mother used to plant flowers every spring. One evening, my father called me into the living room. He stood beside the wooden cabinet where the safe was placed. In his hand was a small silver object. He placed it in my palm, my mother's necklace. The round pendant felt cold in my hand, the letter M engraved on it slightly worn with time. My father spoke slowly, his voice rougher than usual. "Your mother always believed you would be the one who kept this family together." I gently closed my fingers around the necklace. In my mind, I saw my mother in the backyard years ago, holding a watering can and calling us inside for dinner when the sky began to darken. But some things, once broken, cannot be put back together the same way. I told my father I would move out for a while, a small apartment near the hospital where I worked. He didn't stop me. He only nodded slowly. The morning I left, my suitcase sat in the trunk of the car. My father stood on the porch just like the day Dylan was taken away. Before I closed the car door, he spoke. "Scarlett." I turned around. He looked down at the front yard before saying something that made me stop longer than I planned. "Dylan wasn't the first person who tried to take money from this house." I froze when I heard that. My hand still resting on the car door, I turned back toward him. He didn't look at me immediately. His eyes moved toward the house behind him, where we had lived for almost 30 years. "What do you mean?" I asked. My father exhaled slowly, as if deciding how much he should say. Finally, he stepped down from the porch and walked slowly closer to my car. "Many years ago," he said, "when you were still a child, someone in our family tried to take control of the family property." I had never heard that story before. My father continued, saying that when he and my mother were young, a relative had tried to interfere with the family's land documents. It worried my mother for a long time. She didn't like talking much about money, but she was very careful with things that belonged to the family. That was why she was the one who suggested installing cameras in the house, not to watch outsiders, but to protect what she believed should remain for her children in the future. After saying that, my father fell silent for a moment. I remembered the old house when I was little, the times my mother stood on a chair adjusting a small camera in the corner of the wall. Back then, I thought she just wanted the house to be safer. I never imagined those cameras would one day become part of a story like this. My father looked at me again, his voice lower. Dylan discovered them a long time ago. I suddenly realized the house had not only been destroyed by Dylan from the inside, it had already been weakened by secrets buried by the generation before us. My father had tried to protect us by hiding the scars of the family, but he didn't realize that silence had created empty spaces where Dylan's selfishness and calculations could grow. Maybe the most painful lesson I learned wasn't how to face an enemy. It was realizing that sometimes we must leave a house full of memories in order to save our own soul before it rots along with everything else. I looked up again. My father said that a few years earlier, Dylan had become curious about the camera system. He said he wanted to learn how to repair and upgrade it. At the time, my father didn't think much of it. Dylan always said he was good with technology, and my father let him do it. 1 week after Dylan was arrested, the police returned to the house to examine more data from the old camera system. They found a video clip that had never been completely deleted. My father opened his phone and showed me the clip. The video was recorded in Dylan's old bedroom. In the mirror, Dylan stood in front of the closet wearing a dark coat. He took a few steps, stopped, then looked at himself in the mirror. In that brief moment, Dylan smiled. He walked a few steps, stopped, and tried again. Each time he stopped, he adjusted his hair and tried to imitate the way I walked. My father stood beside me as the video ended. He didn't say anything else. Only a small sound escaped his throat, like a breath caught halfway. I looked at him and for the first time in many years saw my father cry. Not because of the money, not because of the house, but because of the son he had trusted. I held my mother's silver necklace in my hand again. The pendant felt cold but familiar. Some truths, once spoken, change everything. But at least this time the truth was no longer hidden. I had kept my mother's necklace for many years, and it was the only thing that brought me peace during those stormy days. What about you? Do you have a keepsake you treasure, something that helped you through the hardest moments in your life? Share your story with me. I closed the car door, started the engine, and drove away from the familiar street, my mother's necklace resting quietly in my palm. A few months later, I moved into a small apartment near the hospital where I worked. The apartment was on the third floor of an old building overlooking a street lined with maple trees. It wasn't large or luxurious, but in the mornings when I opened the window, I could hear buses passing by and smell coffee from the cafe on the corner. My life became quieter in a way I had never imagined before. No more arguments in the house, no more walking into the living room wondering who was angry with whom that day, just hospital shifts, patients who needed care, and evenings returning to a softly lit room. My father called sometimes. The first calls were short and hesitant. He usually asked whether I had eaten dinner yet, whether my shift was exhausting, then paused for a few seconds before saying goodbye. After some time, we began talking a little longer, not to revisit what had happened, but simply to keep a small thread between the two people left in the family. The old house still stands there, empty, but it is no longer the place I once called home. Half the land has been sold to repay the debt. The flower garden my mother once cared for each spring is now only scattered wild grass. My father says he still keeps the old wooden chair where my mother used to sit and read every afternoon, but I have never had the courage to return there since the day I left with my suitcase. As for Dylan, he remains trapped in the legal storm surrounding the case. Not a single meeting, not a phone call, not even an explanation. Everything now exists only in dry messages from his lawyer. The case is ongoing. That's all. Some evenings after my shift, I sit alone by the apartment window, holding my mother's silver necklace in my hand. The small round pendant, the letter M slightly worn by time. Every time I touch it, I remember the old house, the dinners when the whole family once sat around the table together, and the simple feeling that everything would always stay that way. This story was created with the support of AI and edited by humans, inspired by real-life situations and human experiences to bring reflection and emotion to viewers. The content does not encourage anyone to imitate the actions in this story. If there is one thing I learned after everything that happened, it is this. Sometimes the hardest thing in life is not facing a betrayal, but accepting that the person who betrayed you was once your family. If you are listening to this story right now, I truly want to know where you are. Maybe in your living room, in your car after a long day, or somewhere quiet like where I am now. Leave a comment and let me know. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. Honestly, the time you spent listening means a lot. If this story made you think or reminded you of something in your own life, please hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next stories. And if you want, you can share this story with someone you think might understand it. Sometimes just hearing a story told out loud is enough to remind someone they are not alone.